Picture the world in the year AD 1000. Across the cold waters of North Atlantic, a fleet of Viking longships cuts through waves. On board are Norse explorers led by Leif Erikson, sailing further west than almost anyone in Europe believed possible. After leaving Greenland behind, they arrive on the shores of a vast new land filled with dense forests, fresh rivers, and abundant wildlife. This place would become known as Vinland. For a brief moment in history, the Vikings had done what no other Europeans had achieved. They had reached North America almost 500 years before Christopher Columbus. The Norse established a small settlement. They built timber longhouses, they repaired their ships, and explored the surrounding coastline. Archaeological discoveries at Meadows in Newfoundland have confirmed that this remarkable journey really happened. Yet despite this incredible achievement, the colony never lasted. The Greenland settlements that supplied Vinland were themselves small and isolated, with only a few thousand people. Maintaining regular voyages across the Atlantic was expensive and very dangerous. While the new settlement remained vulnerable to harsh winters, had limited resources and occasional conflict with the indigenous peoples, without enough settlers to make the colony self-sufficient, Vinland was abandoned, becoming little more than a forgotten chapter preserved within the Icelandic sagas. But what if history had unfolded differently? What if the ships never stopped coming? Imagine that every summer, more Norse families arrive from Greenland, Iceland, and eventually Scandinavia itself. Farmers, craftsmen, fishermen, and traders gradually transformed a temporary camp into a permanent community. Instead of disappearing into history, Vinland survived. At first, growth would have been slow. Unlike the colonial empires that would emerge centuries later, the Vikings simply lacked the population to conquer vast territories. Their settlements would spread cautiously along the Atlantic coastline, connected by sea routes rather than roads. Small fishing villages would become trading ports, while scattered farms slowly expanded into thriving coastal towns. Survival would depend on adaptation. The Norse would learn from the indigenous peoples who had lived on this land for thousands of years, adopting local hunting techniques, discovering unfamiliar plants, and navigating landscapes they had never encountered before. In return, European iron tools, shipbuilding knowledge, and new farming methods would begin to spread through regional trade. Conflict would undoubtedly occur, but with neither side able to dominate the other completely, cooperation would often prove far more valuable than conquest. As centuries passed, Vinland would begin to develop an identity all of its own. The settlers would still honour their Scandinavian roots, but distance has a way of changing people. Their language would gradually evolve into something distinct from Old Norse. Their architecture would blend Nordic traditions with local materials. Their culture would become neither entirely European nor entirely indigenous, but something uniquely North American. Back across the Atlantic, Europe would also begin to change. Instead of Vinland fading into legend, it would become a recognised part of the known world. Medieval maps would show lands beyond Greenland. Merchants would travel west in search of timber, fish, and other valuable furs. Kings would see opportunity across the ocean centuries before the great age of exploration had even begun. This alone could reshape European history. Rather than the Spanish and Portuguese leading Atlantic expansion, the Scandinavian kingdoms would already possess established trade routes and overseas settlements. Norway and Denmark might become major maritime powers, competing alongside England and France for influence across the Atlantic. Then comes the year 1492. Christopher Columbus still convinces the Spanish crown to fund his westward voyage in search of Asia. But this time, Europe already knows that lands exist across the Atlantic. His journey is no longer one of discovery, but one of exploration. History remembers Columbus as an important navigator, but not as the man who found a new continent. That title belongs to Leif Erikson, whose settlement never disappeared. As European empires expanded across the Americas over the following centuries, they would no longer encounter an untouched Atlantic frontier. Instead, they would find a civilization that had already existed for generations. Vinland would become an established Atlantic nation in its own right, negotiating alliances, defending its borders, and competing economically with its European neighbours. English and French colonies would still emerge, but they would need to share the continent with a kingdom whose roots stretched back to the Viking Age itself. Fast forward to the present day. The northeastern coastline of North America could look remarkably different. Rather than crossing directly from Canada into the Atlantic provinces, you might instead enter the independent nation of Vinland. Its cities could overlook the same rugged coastlines first explored by Viking longships well over 1,000 years ago. Government buildings might stand beside churches whose origins date back to the early Middle Ages. The national language would still carry echoes of the Old Norse, while place names reflect a heritage unlike anywhere else in the Americas. Its culture would represent 1,000 years of shared history between Scandinavian settlers and indigenous communities, creating traditions, literature, and national celebrations found nowhere else on Earth. The ripple effects would extend far beyond North America. Scandinavia itself would occupy a far more prominent place in global affairs. While the history of exploration, colonialization, and international politics would be rewritten around a simple but extraordinary fact: Europe never lost America. In our timeline, Vinland became a historic footnote, a small settlement remembered only through archaeology and ancient sagas. But had those first Viking settlers endured, their great legacy would not have been discovering a new world. It would have been creating one.